Marco Vitelli found out too late that the woman he publicly humiliated at the Oldgate Club fundraiser was the same woman who had been quietly dismantling his financial empire for 6 weeks. By the time he understood what was happening, she had already won. This is the story of how Rosalind Vega, the most underestimated person in the room on every occasion she chose to be, made Marco Vitelli's name disappear from every account, every holding, every deed in the city of Chicago. And how Dominic Sorrano watched all of it happen and made exactly one decision he would never regret. Rosalind Vega was 34 years old, 5'4", with the kind of full figure that filled out a blazer-like architecture. Not hidden, not apologized for, not explained. She was a forensic accountant with 14 years tracing money through shell corporations, offshore accounts, and charitable fronts. She had worked for the FBI, then for private clients who paid 3 times more and asked fewer questions about methods. She wore her dark hair pinned back on working days and let it fall loose only when she had already finished the job. She arrived at every room looking like she belonged to the furniture. That was the point. That had always been the point. Dominic Sorrano ran the North Side operation from a building on West Grand that officially housed a commercial real estate advisory. He was 41, quiet in the way that powerful men are quiet when they no longer need to announce themselves. 3 cities knew his name. He had never once needed to raise his voice in a negotiation because the alternative was always understood. He had been watching Rosalind for 4 days before the fundraiser, not because he suspected her, but because he noticed her, and noticing people was the only habit that had kept him alive this long. Marco Vitelli ran the financial side of the Oldgate organization. He was the kind of man who understood numbers, but had never once in his life felt afraid of one. He had grown up watching his father grovel before men like Dominic Sorrano, and he had decided very early that he would never be that man. He acquired his confidence the same way people acquire debt, fast, on borrowed terms, with very little understanding of what happens when it's called in. What he feared most, underneath the Italian suits and the Rolex and the table he always reserved at the front, was being laughed at. He had spent 37 years ensuring that the laughter always came from him, never toward him. It was, in the end, the most revealing thing about him. The Oldgate Club fundraiser for the Children's Hospital drew 200 people in black tie. Rosalind was there as the guest of a pharmaceutical client. She was standing near the bar with a glass of sparkling water she never drank at events where she was working when Marco Vitelli moved through the room and stopped in front of her with the particular kind of pause that precedes a performance. He looked her over. Then he said, loudly enough for the 6 people nearest them to hear, "They must have run out of chairs at the adults' table, or maybe the chairs just gave out." He smiled at the man beside him. The man beside him laughed. A woman nearby went very still and looked at her shoes. Rosalind looked at Marco Vitelli for a moment, not with fury, not with tears, with the flat, patient attention of someone reading a label on a product she has already decided not to purchase. Then she said quietly, "Enjoy your evening, Mr. Vitelli," and she turned back to the bar. Marco Vitelli, unsatisfied with a response that gave him nothing to push against, moved on to find better entertainment. He had already forgotten her name by the time he reached the other side of the room. He did not know that he had never actually known it. Dominic Sorrano had been standing 12 feet away. He watched all of it. He watched the way she held herself during the comment, the slight lift of her chin, the controlled exhale, the complete refusal to perform distress. He watched the way her hands did not move. He watched the way she waited until Vitelli was gone, before she let herself close her eyes for exactly 1 second and then reopen them and resume being present. What Dr. Linda Hartling, in her foundational research on humiliation at the Stone Center at Wellesley, identified is that public shaming does not merely wound pride in the moment. It activates a neurological threat response identical to physical danger, rewiring the target's sense of worth for months or years afterward. What Dominic Sorrano saw was a woman who had apparently built something inside herself that was stronger than the rewiring. He found himself intensely curious about how she had done that. He did not introduce himself that night. He filed what he had seen, and he left. What nobody at the Aldgate Club knew, what Marco Vitelli would not understand until it was too late, was that Rosalind Vega had been hired by an anonymous client 6 weeks earlier to conduct a forensic audit of Aldgate's financial structure. She had taken the job because the fees were substantial and because she had been told only that the client believed Aldgate was laundering money through the hospital fundraising network. The very network she was now standing inside, drinking sparkling water, being publicly mocked for her size. She had been making herself invisible in Vitelli's world deliberately. She attended 3 Aldgate-connected events as a peripheral guest. She let herself be overlooked. She let herself be condescended to. She took notes on who reacted to which pressures and who carried their defensiveness like a weapon. Marco Vitelli had handed her the most useful intelligence she had collected. He was terrified of being embarrassed. That fear would be the instrument. She had already traced $42 million through 7 holding structures before the night of the fundraiser. She needed 3 more weeks to reach the layer where Vitelli's personal accounts connected to the offshore architecture. She continued to be invisible. She continued to be forgettable. She continued to be the woman whose name Marco Vitelli had not bothered to retain. Nobody watching her move through those weeks would have guessed what she was building. That was, of course, the entire design. Then Marco Vitelli made his one mistake. It was not the comment at the bar. That was simply the moment that would matter later for a different reason. His real mistake came 11 days after the fundraiser, when he noticed that 3 of his mid-level accounts were showing unusual reconciliation patterns. He assumed it was an internal bookkeeping error. He called in his own accountant. His accountant found nothing. Vitelli was reassured and forgot about it. He should not have forgotten about it. Rosalind had been leaving those patterns deliberately, small enough to be dismissed, specific enough to confirm which accounts were connected. She was not just tracing the money, she was mapping who Vitelli trusted, who he called when something felt wrong, and how quickly he moved to cover rather than to investigate. He had shown her all 3 answers in 48 hours. By the time she was ready to act, she had a complete picture of Aldgate's financial architecture across 11 jurisdictions, documentation of 36 months of laundering activity, and a precise understanding of which regulatory authorities would find this material most immediately actionable. She also had, separately, documentation of something Marco Vitelli had not realized anyone outside his operation knew. He had been skimming from Dominic Sorrano's connected accounts for 14 months. It was this last piece she sat with for 2 days before deciding what to do with it. Dominic Sorrano's assistant called her on a Tuesday morning. He asked if she would be available for a brief meeting at an address on West Grand. She said she would check her calendar and confirm by end of day. She confirmed by noon. She had not sought this meeting. He had found her. She did not know yet exactly what he knew or how he had come to know it. She went anyway because information moved in one direction, toward resolution, and the only question was whose resolution she was walking into. The office on West Grand was quieter than she expected. Sorrano was behind a desk that held nothing on it except a single folder and a glass of water. He stood when she entered, which she had not anticipated. He gestured to the chair across from him. He said, "You were at the Aldgate event 3 weeks ago." She said, "I was." He said, "Vitelli said something to you." She said, "He did?" He waited. She did not fill the silence. He looked at her with a particular attention, not predatory, not dismissive, but the look of someone recalibrating. He said, "I've had my own people looking at Aldgate's books for 2 months. They found 3 layers. You've found 11. She said, 12 as of this morning. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The skimming." She said, "Yes." He said, "You're going to the authorities." She said, "My client hired me to produce documentation." What my client chooses to do with it is my client's business, not mine. She paused. I'm telling you what I found because you have a material interest in what happens next, and because you should make whatever decisions you need to make from a position of information rather than surprise. He looked at her for a long time. Nobody in that room fully understood yet what had just shifted between them. She slid a copy of the executive summary across the desk. 12 pages. Clean, annotated, sourced. He read the first 3 pages without looking up. Then he said, Vitelli's hosting a dinner Thursday. His accounts connect to 3 of mine through the meridian structure on page 7. If what you've documented goes to the financial crimes unit before Thursday, those accounts freeze alongside his. She said, I know. He said, you came here to give me time to move them. She said, I came here because you stood 12 feet away at the Old Gate bar and watched what happened and didn't say anything, and I've spent 3 weeks deciding whether that made you complicit or calculating. She looked at him directly. I decided calculating. He said, what's the difference from where you're sitting? She said, a complicit man leaves the money where it is because he doesn't care who gets caught in the drag. A calculating man needs to know what's coming so he can make a real choice. She stood. Now you know what's coming. She left the folder on the desk. She walked out. What John Gottman identified over 4 decades of studying human dynamics. The specific condition he called feeling seen, the neurological experience of being understood precisely as you are rather than as a projection someone needs you to be, is described in his research as the foundation from which genuine commitment becomes possible. Dominic Sorrano sat in his quiet office for 20 minutes after Rosalind Vega walked out the door and understood, with the clinical clarity of a man who had survived this long by reading situations correctly, that he had not felt that in a very long time. He moved his accounts by Wednesday afternoon. The financial crimes referral went in on Thursday morning. Marco Vitelli's dinner did not happen. His accounts were frozen by 2 p.m. By 6 p.m., the documentation had made its way through channels Rosalind had prepared carefully and Sorrano had accelerated to 3 journalists and a federal prosecutor who had been looking for exactly this architecture for 18 months. Vitelli called his attorney. His attorney took the call and then called his own attorney. The dinner table at the front of whatever room Marco Vitelli would occupy next was going to be a great deal smaller. Sorrano called Rosalind on Friday. He said, I want to understand how you built the Meridian Trace. I have a situation in New York that has the same structure at a different scale. She said, that would be a separate engagement. He said, name a number. She named 1. He said, when can you start? She said, I already have. He paused. He almost said something. Then he said, what's your middle name? She said, why? He said, because I've said your name to 4 different people this week and I realized I only have the one and I want to make sure I have all of them right. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Elena. He said, Rosalind Elena Vega. She said, yes. He said, I won't forget it. He did not forget it. 3 weeks later, when a man in New York made a comment at a client dinner that was not as public as the Aldgate bar, but was audible enough, Sorrano set down his glass and said very quietly 4 sentences. No one at the table laughed. The man who had spoken found his contract with Sorrano's organization dissolved by email the following morning. No explanation offered, none required. Rosalind found out about it from someone else. She called him. She said, you didn't need to do that, he said. I know, she said. I handled Vitelli without anyone's help. He said, I know that too. This wasn't about what you needed. It was about what I wanted. A pause. There's a difference. She held the phone for a moment. She said, yes, there is. Some people spend their whole lives being underestimated and let the bitterness of it hollow them out. Rosalind Vega spent those same years turning the underestimation into infrastructure. The man who finally saw what she had built did not offer her protection. He offered her a seat beside him as the person who had already proven she didn't need saving. If this story stayed with you, a like takes 2 seconds and tells me it's worth continuing. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one, because the woman in that story is only getting started.